done by people outside the mainstream medical community who have attempted to look at what happens to the nanoparticle when it's injected into the body. And they have found that not only does it penetrate the brain, it persists for years. And so, again, if we're seeing a public health emergency of chronically disabled and chronically ill children, and we know that there are ingredients in vaccines that can potentially contribute to that happening, and we don't have any scientific studies examining whether or not any of these ingredients contribute to the development of these chronic inflammatory conditions, we have a problem.
I agree with your central argument. If you were really talking about proven causality, what you've described over and over again seems to be a correlation. However, you fail to take into account the tens of thousands of chemicals we've introduced into our food, into our environment. Have we evaluated all those? And should we be stopping all those 10,000 chemicals because they may be the cause of the presence of these various elements in the brain?
No, I appreciate that. But there's a difference between what you inhale and what you ingest and what you inject. And what you inhale and what you ingest has the capacity for the immune system along the airway and the immune system along the 26 feet of intestines in children, plus the liver, to actually eliminate that before it gets into the body. But when you deliver it through an injection, 100% of it gets in, and it's never been studied as to what happens to it and whether or not it stays in the body, and what it does when it stays in the body, and what does it bring with it, especially since we know that there are contaminants in vaccines, like foreign cells, like foreign DNA. I mean, in 2005, the FDA reported that they knew that there was foreign DNA in the vaccines, and they didn't study it at all. But they did make a side note and say, well, we don't know if it's going to cause any damage, and it could, but we're just going to tell you what the amount that's legal for being in the vaccine. So we don't know everything that's attached to these nanoparticles. We assume that when you inject the vaccine, it's not going to hurt you. We also assume that it's going to give you immunity, and neither of those is true.
I'm still focused on the fact that we do know that many chemicals in our environment are carcinogenic, are endocrine disruptors, that have any number of other create mutations and the like, and those are not injected. So many of those things are present that end up in our bloodstream because they've been ingested or through other means. I'm just not quite sure I can buy your argument this is all because of vaccines, because you've noticed some of these incidents when there are all these other factors in our environment that coincidentally have been introduced along the same time frame as vaccines that could equally, if not more likely, be involved given their pure number of them involved.
I appreciate that question. The fact of the matter is that vaccine ingredients have never been tested for mutagenicity or carcinogenicity. And there are actually statements in the package inserts that say that this product has never been tested to see whether it causes mutations in the DNA or whether it causes cancer. So you're right. I think we should be equally concerned about the injection of these materials. But I'll say that in over 21 years of actually watching the health of vaccinated children in the same community as the health of unvaccinated children, I don't see nearly as many chronic inflammatory conditions in those who are unvaccinated as I do in those who are vaccinated. And a colleague of mine is currently engaged in a wonderful study looking at the health outcomes of fully vaccinated children, partially vaccinated children, and unvaccinated children. And in his preliminary data, he's already seeing quite a stark, statistically significant difference that the unvaccinated children are unanimously healthier with fewer chronic illnesses. The next fewer illnesses are seen in the partially vaccinated children, and the most severe chronically inflamed conditions are seen in the fully vaccinated children. So I think we do have observational data just by watching to see, well, how many of the kids in the community who don't get vaccinated actually have cancer? How many do get cancer living in the same community who are vaccinated? Those vax versus unvax studies have never been done by the mainstream media, by the mainstream medical community or scientific community. So I agree with you. I think environmental chemicals are definitely a concern, but we're seeing stark differences just based on vaccinated versus partially vaccinated versus unvaccinated in the same communities. And we're seeing it in the same families, where you have parents who vaccinated their eldest child, saw very significant damage done to that child, and then had 2 or 3 more children and did not vaccinate them or partially vaccinated them. They have their own study because they see that the youngest who have not been vaccinated are far and away the healthiest, living in the same home, living in the same environment, the same exposure to toxins, the same exposure to parenting, same foods, same medical care, and different health outcomes. And my experience is that the medical community refuses to acknowledge that there are faults with the vaccination system that are much greater. Vaccine injury is much more widespread than we're giving it credit for. And when you have 2 to 10% of your children in the community who might not even develop an antibody, you already have a tremendous number of children who are not even immune. So we're saying that all these children are immune, but vaccination doesn't guarantee immunity, especially for those who don't develop an antibody, and then for those who do and don't even get protection even if they do. It strikes me that we're sitting in a scientific community and we're saying that if you vaccinate a child, the virus or the bacteria just disappear from their body and they can't transmit it anymore. That has never been proven, but it is generally believed to be true. And we propagate that without really looking at the science. So we're making a lot of assumptions that the only people carrying the germs that we have to worry about are the unvaccinated, because somehow the adults don't carry it, and somehow the vaccinated couldn't possibly carry it because they've been vaccinated, even though more than 10% of them might not even be immune from it. So there are a lot of assumptions here that I think we're just agreeing to that really is not scientific at all.
I would certainly agree with you. There are a lot of assumptions in this conversation.